Hello.
Hello.
Hello. This is such an odd setup because it's just odd. Okay, so I'll start and give a bit of context and do the whole hello, blah blah blah. So I am a live artist, a performance artist, and a writer from Birmingham. And they sent me this email and said, would you like to have a conversation with another artist about the broad idea of artists make change in a way that you would want to do? And I said yes, and I thought about you. And full disclosure for the video, I am I'm neurodivergent, so I might stutter, I might take longer to get my words out, just like this, and that's how I speak and those conversations might go. So that's yeah, and yeah, and I'm really happy to have you here. If you just want to say like,
Thank you, yeah.
who you are, like it doesn't have to be a lot, but just be like who you are and what sort of what work you do.
Yeah, okay. So I'm a poet and I write, and I like to say I'm increasingly like to say that I'm a poet and an educator, but I don't actually think those things are separate. I think that's very much, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, but I think yeah, I see those things in dialogue, and I generally try to use my work to ask questions or disrupt the kind of like mainstream narratives that we hear about race, gender, Islamophobia, history, like these big conceptual things, but in a way that I hope is a bit more human, and not in just a very like. I think I don't know. I think that intro that you just were saying was interesting because I think there's lots of ways in which people don't even know that the conversations that we already have in our lives are so political and are so relevant. But yeah, that's me. I'm really glad that you decided to pick me for this conversation. I was really excited when I got the email. So I'm looking forward to this.
All right. Well, let's just so I wrote down a few questions and ideas, and maybe it's the idea of like starting off of what is it actually looking at what's been stated, I suppose, this idea artists make change. Mm-hmm. And for both of us, what does that mean? And like, so is art a tool for change, or you know, like, and I suppose then who uses that tool? Like, right. If art makes change, or artists make change, does that, I feel like then is there something wider with like, well, what's the power in, who has power over that? Or because that's, to me that sounds like that blanket statement, artists make change. It's like, it's quite self-determinating, it's quite a but then when really we look at the landscape, if we say then where artists sit in positions of power or sit in positions of change, it doesn't seem to be. So maybe, so it's, I think, maybe let's have a chat, or what you think about the idea of what change is in that term, like what it is to change, what do we, I suppose what they're putting forward in this R&D is what can be changed. Sorry, what change, and can change be a spectrum of things? And should there be a priority to that? I'm just gonna stop. I just keep going on, but
no, I think no, I was just gonna say, I think also like when I first saw that or when I was thinking that question, I think another thing is just like, well, what is art? Because it's, when I was just thinking back on my own like interactions with what art is, I think for the majority of my life I thought art was this very static thing actually that definitely has nothing to do with change, and it's like you go maybe on a school trip to the art gallery and that is where art is, and it's in these places that have always been around, and it's and so almost I think there's this way in which art is made to seem like this really non-changing kind of traditional formal thing. And I think all those words and all the connotations of that are obviously really gatekeepy, and it doesn't feel like, I think even to call myself an artist, I still feel like that's really awkward, and I feel like, oh, am I an artist? Oh, and I think that itself tells us that there's lots of art that's made that isn't seen as art. And for example, if I've been able to think about just even the way that my grandma speaks is poetic, that this is a form of, there's like a rich texture here, but you never really get to do that with things that are classed as non-art and classed as, it's like, oh, she have nothing to, what will she understand about art? She's some immigrant woman, like that's just so far from what she could possibly engage with. And I think all those elements of class and race and all of that directly feeds into what we think of as art. And I think even now I really struggle with, not really struggle, but I think I still struggle with thinking outside of those boxes. And, I like trying to recognize in recent years that like, my grandma loves cooking and she's an amazing cook. And I always think like, if she was a white man born in Britain, what would we call her? What words would we use to describe her? Like, would we talk about the aesthetics of her food? Would we talk about it as an art, like as a talent? And I think all of that stuff also then means that it's like this question also requires us to rethink, or just to think about what art is, because if it is something that everybody's actually capable of and everybody actually is doing all the time, then it's a really human thing, and it actually probably is very obviously connected to change, because form of human expression is probably how we change the world and how we change even just like small relationships and everything in our lives. So yeah, I don't know, that's just like a thought I was having as well, is like, yeah, each of those, like, what is artists, what is change, but what is art? And
I find that, I it's so interesting because me and others that I like are friends of mine, we're constantly talking about how because I do some live artwork, and I can sometimes sit in that kind of space, and we were talking about how the element of live art, or seen to be, is very a free radical kind of, technically in terms it comes out of like theatre, so then it subverts that or looks at it differently, and there's then people that feel outside of theatre then do that, if that makes sense. It's like there's and what's really funny about that is though, but I see loads of live artists and friends and colleagues and peers that are white, and they get to kind of live in all their themselves, so they can be a live artist in all these contexts. But as soon as like I'm taught, so I'm very mindful of like, when I say myself I'm a live artist to my family, and they're just a bit like, what? Or like, I don't know, it's the thing about words, I suppose, because when you said what did you say? Yeah, because a lot of, so when anything comes down to something that is like other or non-white, it feels like, or non-middle class, like there's these things where it's like, oh, a community arts, and you're like, and it's not like, I'm like, literally there's nothing wrong with saying community arts. Those two words are but they're so loaded, aren't they? Right. They're not neutral. Like, I know words aren't neutral at all, but they're so loaded. And it depends also who says it, because I'll go to an organisation and they'll be like, cool, we want to work with you, we want to do this because we're really engaging in like socially engaged community work, and you're like, that just means code for you think that something's going to not go into your big arena. It's going to go in the small back room, and it's just going to be all brown and black people, and that's it. And like that's where, like, the disabled and neurodivergent people are just going to go. It's just a bit like, yeah, okay. So that's what this is what I'm, an interesting thing, because anytime it's interesting because these conversations about artists make change, I've always kind of been in them or been around them since I started being an artist. And this is the first time that I'm looking at it from a lens of going, can we just unpack first where we're coming from, if that makes sense. Like, who's putting this agenda together to say artists can make change that they want? Does that make sense? Like, I think, like, you know, like, some people don't want to claim the word artist. Some people don't want to, you know, I've got a friend of mine that I work together quite a lot with, and they just kind of they've given up that word because they also see it as a barrier to their community, certain parts of their community, and they're just like, I still make art, but that label doesn't serve me in this certain way. So it's interesting to see that kind of like so it's funny because even before, because I was thinking about it, and then I was like, okay, so, you know, they make change, what are those limitations or what are those things, and then I was just like, oh, actually just even just looking at artist and the word change, and they're not, they mean different things to different people, and that intersects with class and race and and
I think there's also like this because as much as, so I think like the disclaimer is like, I definitely do think artists can and should make change, right, as a very like superficial comment, but I think I also just thinking on what you're saying, I feel like there's another weird trend as well, which I feel, I mean, I'm sure that you've witnessed this as well, and I would love to hear about your experiences, but where it's kind of like this, I want to call it like a co-option of like, of change, what change means as well. And it's this kind of thing of like, I guess I'll just say in my own experience, it kind of feels like people will approach me for having seen maybe like some of my poetry or something, and they'll be like, and sorry, I'm talking about like the theatre world as well, and this live art world that you're talking about, and which I don't really have any experience of until very recently, and it's very limited and not very supported way, which is another conversation I'm sure we can have. But I think what I find so weird about it as well is like this thing of like, your identity is suddenly edgy, and it's suddenly like you yourself are the change, just your very existence in the world is the thing. And I don't know, like, what's your experience of that? Because I find it so confusing.
Good. And what's interesting thing is, because I've been around the world. I've been in the art world since, it's gonna be about 10 years now, on and off, based on me being ill, etc., and, you know, like working and going, well, I can't live off this, so I'm gonna fuck off with it, and then go back in and go, but I must be this. But anyway, and like, I started off the journey very much like, because you get people affirming you, and obviously my learning or my knowledge was very limited, or you know, so it was very much like, okay, so I am the check, like, you know, you know, and then that rhetoric of like, you know, just doing it, or being, sorry, not doing it, but being there is the thing that's, and that's the same with like, you know, the diversity and the representation, and I also feel like we're still very stuck in those words, and I'm just like, wow, like, because the discourse around it from people in different, I suppose, is actually like, I suppose I'm going, I'll come back to that because I don't know where I'm going with that, but like I've lost my train of thought.
You saying about like the discourse around being the change. Oh
yeah, and it's been like that for like 10 years, and then at the start of it for me, my 10 years, and then you start of it, and then you're like, oh, okay, this is, you know, this is actually, you know, it's, you fall for the kind of that those trappings, because you think, oh, this is how it works. You get lots that look like you, or like are the marginalized, and you get together, and then you build up in that space, but actually there's no structural space for that, so then you end up in that one, and then over the years and years and years, and then you get burnt out, and then they just swap you over. So it's like, you know, there's systems, and we know that now and then, really, but I feel like I knew it then, but I didn't really have a language to be like, this just feels like I don't know, you know, when you like think about like liberal feminism, like it just feels so like because until you learn other things about it, you feel like there's a feeling where you think this just doesn't have like enough grit in it. There's not enough. It feels really shallow.
Yeah.
And until then, you get to a point where you go, oh, I know what that was. It was that and that, and it wasn't. It's not systemic. That's not change.
Yeah, that makes me feel like the question is also like, what change do we let artists make, or what change do we want artists to make? Because I think that's, everything you're saying also just, it really reveals like this, as you're saying, like just this limit to the change. It's like bring the like aesthetic that you bring, but don't actually, I mean, like it's really worrying because the advice that I always get from people who are kind of have much more experience in just all these different worlds of art and industries is always very much around be really cautious, be really careful, like don't trust people too easily because people will just want to like, use your energy, use your work, and then just kind of discard you. And I think, because the other question then is like, I think you've touched on it a few times as well, like burnout and even like your 10 years in art and kind of being on and off and stuff, and how, I think there's also this thing of like art being this product of the artist, but the artists themselves, I don't know, this is like a bit of a just open-ended thought that I'm having, but it's like what we want them to change things, but because basically my head at the moment has been really much in this space of like, I think so much of the ways that I think about justice in the world often kind of skip a really important step, which is my own self as like somebody, and like what does it mean for us to link being just to myself and experiencing like spiritual, emotional, mental justice, like what does that mean? And then, because how can I talk about, well, I can, but like, how, these things aren't separate, like structural injustice and injustice myself. And I guess I'm just thinking about like, if we want artists to make change, but we don't want artists to be well, what does that mean as well? And like, I don't know.
Because when you were saying that, as soon as you were saying that, someone was saying, be careful, be cautious, they'll use your energy. It's so exploitative, isn't it? And if you would have taken the words out and talked about a different industry there, you would have been like, that doesn't sound like the art world, or like, doesn't sound like the theatre world. Right? And you're like, because there's this weird thing where artists are great, everyone's great, organizations are great, and they're not toxic, and they're not, but the industry is set up to exploit, is it? And it's interesting because I haven't used the word exploit like in terms of the word, in terms of how I make work, the industry I'm in. It felt too much, but actually, I've been very empowered over the last few months and few weeks to see that no, like it is exploitation, and also to know that we're part of a structure that you are in proximity to exploiting someone else, and you put harm onto others, and that kind of like starting to really deconstruct where you sit and what you do. Because actually one of the reasons I feel like I have a lot of conversations with people around shame. So I grew up with feeling like shame was a tool for change, right? But that comes out of trauma. So there was this idea that for me, we could shame a family member and that would change someone's behavior, right? And to a certain extent it would work. So that's kind of embedded in me, which I don't, it's like it's just a reaction thing to do. I'll not take to like shaming, or shaming myself and shaming others to see action, right? And for the last few years, I've very much said to people and myself, I said, no, I truly believe there's something about an act of shaming someone, but not shaming someone because we're not shaming someone, we're shaming structure. So I'm shaming an institution. But then someone come back to me and said, yeah, I get what you're saying, but that's so abstract because that person that's doing their Twitter or the person that you're emailing is still a person. So they will then shut down or off or whatever that is. And I'm like, and that always makes me feel like, okay, that's why we never, I don't know, because then, and also in the last few weeks, I've really learned or like seeing so much, and I'm so grateful to to like have kind of like a new awareness or like a new kind of perspective about how much I must be invested in the like in harm, like in culpability, like, so, you know, I'll say like hold people accountable, but a lot of time I feel like we're part of a system where it's like like fuck up, like really like fuck up. That's not me talking about cancel culture, because that's something completely different, and also that's also a weird co-opting thing. But I mean, actually, like for me, it's like, like I don't know, but then it's so loaded, because at the same time, it's like certain these systems need to be completely eradicated and like started again. Like, I don't know if you saw the freelance task force.
No.
So the freelance task force is a response to COVID from artists, but I hope I haven't get this wrong, but I could be. But a lot of theatres, organisations, people have nominated freelancers, and these freelancers are part of this big task force about making sure freelancers are part of the conversation moving forward and not forgetting freelancers. And I just felt like, and I've got lots of people that I know and are dear friends that have got like part of it, and you know, and I'm just like, but actually what's so interesting about that structure to get to this, making this task force, which seems to be really like, you know, like democratic, or like, you know, like you can come together and there's loads of people, blah blah blah, but actually to get appointed or to be nominated, you have to be affiliated, not affiliated, but you have to, the person that's nominating you or whoever it is has to tell this theatre. Why do people know this theatre? You don't like the proximity to institutions and organisations as artists are so important. Like, they're so important, and it's just like so frustrating, because like,
well, it's set up to not. I think this just goes back to the thing of like who gets to make the art, then to do the change. And like, I think just like some stuff I was thinking about when you were saying that as well is like that thing as well, that like, because I remember someone saying this to me as well, like institutions are made up of loads of people, and like, you know what you were saying about that email you send, yes, but I think like I don't think they're not separate things, right? I think we can hold both those things in our heads at the same time. And I think that's why it is really important that individual artists do have a sense of responsibility too, because I think sometimes there's also this notion of like, you know, even like, I found this on like, is it like on TV and film sets, they'll be like, or I don't even, maybe it's in other places too, where they'll talk about like, oh, like the talent, and it's like the talent is like the label for like the person who's the actor, or whatever. And I just found that's really interesting, because it's kind of like it's like everything else is operating, and you're just like this part that's not really got an impact. And at the same time, that's really the only part that anybody sees. And then I'm just thinking about like in this same context. So like, you know, I've had a little bit of experience like doing kind of being commissioned to write a like performance piece for two different institutions, like both quite small, but both times it was like definitely like approached for out of good intentions, right? Like you know, we really like your writing, we like your work, and we think you'll you know, get our audiences to think in certain ways. And I'm like, so here's the thing, it's like, for me, that's great, because I actually do think that, you know, art can also be this tool for getting people to think, getting people to learn new things, getting people to stretch their imaginations. And I think the role of the artist is to be able to dream and to reflect things and mirror things and to say things that other people don't necessarily have a space or time to articulate. But at the same time, these institutions, when I worked with them, it was like just complete. It was like, once you've been commissioned, that's it. No support, no feedback. It was like, I don't really understand. And it was only because where there was like an individual within that institution who I already knew, who was like really supportive to me personally, that I was kind of able to produce anyway. But otherwise, it was just like, what do I do about the fact, like, it's kind of like, you know, you were saying about proximity to the institution. It's kind of like, I I have never thought about staging something. So like, do I need to talk to a director? I don't know. Like, where do I get a director? And then somebody was like, oh, have you thought about lighting? And I was like, is that essential? Like, what do you? And I think you're made to also. There's also like, you're made to feel so inadequate, and so like, you basically, it just seems like you either must emerge as an artist one day, but there's no journey to becoming one, because you just have to just know everything, and you can't be in this weird stage of like, well, it's not weird, it seems very natural, but it's made to seem weird, where you're like me, where I'm just like, okay, I really don't know, like, how do you apply for funding? What is a creative team? Like, so if you just explain a bit about like, what do you mean when you say this word? And I think there's just this really weird like binary in the world of like artists and non-artists, and there's no one who's ever becoming an artist. There's no one who's ever like on their way to trying to understand. I don't know. Yeah, what's your experience?
No, I'm totally with you with that. And what's such an interesting thing is that there's still, but those institutions will still use the words emerging artists.
That's the other one,
right?
yeah.
And put those programs, but then won't actually elect them to emerge, or like say, or actually, because then when they're met with an emerging artist, they'll be like, oh, you are emerging, like you're learning, you're like, that's what you asked for, this is the call that you made, I made this, and I said I'm exploring this, and it's an interesting thing, because it's so frustrating for me, because I'm in a position in my like career where that I feel a little bit further to say to institutions, hang on, you need to show me a bit more care. And I'm so frustrated with younger me, or not younger me, but yeah, younger me, that's nothing to do with age, it's just like when I came into it. But that's how it's set up, isn't it? To not question or think about care, like certainly, because they kept, it's this weird weird niceties of the arts where you think, oh my god, everything is so great, and because we're exploring things that seem to be like on like critiquing society, if we're critiquing it, then surely the people that are critiquing it can't be the ones that don't care for us, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But I've had the most horrendous experiences with art institutions that round care, and I used to call it access, and I sometimes do, and it's interchangeable. So sometimes I say, my access, blah, blah, blah. And then a really great artist called Rhea Hartley, they talked about it in terms of care. And I just made that, I just like words that remind me I'm a human, and it's this connection, and actually you want art based off this, and actually you're okay to tell me if you want to see in capitalist terms and say you want a product, here you go, that's fine, we just got to meet on that clarity. The clarity isn't there because it's wish-washed with words like we're radical, we're bold, we're just these words that just, and then so when you get into that space you expect that care, that radical care, that kind of interpersonal relationship that's really like, oh actually like I can come to you and ask for this, that it's not based on product and
output content,
and then you realize, oh no, they are as like, no, actually, because if you do bring anything up, they'll bring up their policy, this and this, and then you're like, shit, okay. And I can only speak of one theatre that I've worked with, their level of care or level of support and based on and really backing up, we see it as a process, we see you doing this like performance however way you want it, patch it however you want it, cancel it however, really like considering that the work I'm in my context is that my work up to date performance wise is about mental health and trauma. So there's always a layer, and it's autobiographical as well. So there's always an opportunity that I might fall ill, or and I'm very transparent about that. And they seem to be fine at first, and then when it really, theoretically, and when it really starts to happen, you go, I need to pull out that whole tour, and they're like, but you signed a contract. And you're like, I signed a contract, but I did stipulate it. But but then when you sign a contract, you don't. Artists, the best thing, an artist friend that said to me, Selena Thompson, and I think they've said this publicly, so I hope just like but they said like artists, we don't have a union. Like if we like being unionized, that kind of and this is where the critique on this freelance task force, because those words sound great, and you're like, yeah, task force, but it still sits in the remit of just, I haven't got the language for it, but it doesn't go separate to anything, where it's like in a radical model where it's like,
do you feel like, sorry, just on that, like, do you feel there is a community, because you know people like the art community, or the artist community, like what is that community and like where does it exist? Because I think in my experience, actually, I've always felt so isolated when I'm being in that kind of, oh, like go away and write this thing. And even like, I feel like with writing, there is almost like this romanticized notion of it being this very lonesome, and you'll become depressed and you'll be like wrapped up in and you'll go to, you know, a house in the country and it's just like, there's no notion of, just when you're saying care, I was like, well, who's supposed to care? I can't even visualize, there's no one in that picture. It's just like you alone create the art and then you give it to us. And I also just was thinking about, one of my friends recently, she had a really awful experience a while ago working for this arts organization, and they were just she was the only black woman there. They were just really all the microaggressions and macroaggressions you would expect, extraction of labor, you know, calling in non-work hours, all of that. So eventually she left, and then obviously with I think the recent revelation to people that like white supremacy structures the world, they recently just out of the blue asked her, you know, can we commission you to write a poem based on, you know, Black Lives Matter? And I just thought that's such a good example of there's so many things you could have actually, if you just offered an apology, that would have been amazing. That would have been, you done more for racism there than but I think the idea of care and isolation feel really in conversation to me, because like, we leave you alone, we don't care for you, we don't want you, but I don't know.
Yeah, it's like, it feels like, because also like, it depends as well, isn't it? Like, if it's public facing work, it's the priority is to save whatever the public facing work is. So like what you said, like if you go away and there's a process, there is no, it feels so detached. And I've had so many experiences. And when you said about the thing, you know, like you'll go in and be like, oh, lights, you know, like I think first time I was trying to develop a theatre show, and I went to a scratch now, and it was a bit afterwards, and you know, even when I was working on it, and I was working with like a set designer, and they had to tell these lighting people to stop using certain words, or just be like, you need to she doesn't know what you're saying. And I was like, I've been saying it, but was I saying, I was kind of saying it, but it just felt so like just the expectancy, and that feeds into so many artists that then that allows imposter syndrome to really take over. Like especially for like Black and POC artists, they just and then you add like Black and POC disabled artists, they just become like, oh, nothing, no language, no actual, sometimes not even actual like space, physical space is accommodating me, so no language is accommodating me, no metaphorical space is accommodating me. What is the point? I will just go to another industry, or I will just, you know. And that's what
No, I was going to ask, do you also feel like, so within that, I'm assuming, but just correct me if I'm wrong, like there's also then a fetishization of like your work and yourself in that, and it's, I don't know, I'm just wondering what's your experience as well, like with your work being so explicitly around mental health, like how is that actually, because I feel like there must be so much scope for that to be exploited and be like fetishized and be extracted in ways that you just lose your agency over. I don't know, like what's that like? And
that happened a lot, and I still haven't even grappled with actually some of the things I've like, and it, you know, and like I've had many conversations of thinking about over the years and being like, you know, like you don't need to like let your trauma be a source of a sellable thing, right? And I'm like, you've said those words back to me. I never said my trauma is sellable. I've said, do you know what I mean? But it's like, And I'm like, that's what you've said. I have not said that. I've said that I make work about this. And at the moment, the only outlet or the way to be able to live, and as in under these structures and live and eat, is to then present it in this way.
Yeah. And also, who's to say how you process or how you experience? I don't know. That's such a weird thing to say.
Yeah. But then I do understand on the kind of the same, like the flip of like, as in actually, because when you look at the spectrum of work by Black and POC artists, you can see that there's a lot of work that isn't directly about joy or isn't about art for art's sake. You know, that kind of term of like frivolous work. You actually see stuff.
But then do you think that's just because I feel like that's also such a weird demand to put on people, to be like, you should, where is your joy? Like, you know, it's like, that's such a stressful thing. And I feel like if art is, I don't know, like, if I think how I think of art is just like, it's just different ways, and that could be moving your body, that could be saying words, it could be a mixture of expressing things, feelings. I think feelings are like this thing that no one quite understands. Everybody has them. We kind of want to share them, we want to be validated on them. So we try and express them in different ways. And it's like, if the way, I guess what's hard, like, just, sorry, a lot of ideas coming to my mind at the same time, but I think what's hard is that with art, like, I have this split in my head between private and public, where I'm like, this is a poem that I would never share with anyone. And then it's like, this is a poem that's for performing. And I think because inherently an audience exists in that work or in seeing that work, it also becomes hard to make it. I think, because I am just thinking, like, what would it take for me to write a poem that was like, oh, I'm having a lovely day or something, like, and I think it's like, I just think that requires.
It's so funny because I know your work. I'm just like imagining you on stage and being just like, I know what you expect of me, but today you're going to get what I ate for breakfast, dinner and lunch, and that's it. Like,
that's fine, but I think it would take a certain level of safety. And I think when I think of audience, I don't think of safety. I think audience is automatically wants to voyeur and consume my experience in certain ways. And so I already feel not only that, it's not like, oh, I'm going to talk, my art has been about my trauma, but it's almost like my art is about trying to speak about the things I want to on my own terms. And it's actually on my own terms bit that's the really important bit, because otherwise it's like, yeah, okay, even if I wanted to talk about joy, I want to do it on my own terms, because I feel like you're going to say, not you, but this audience, you're going to say, be joyful, and by which you mean don't talk about racism, don't talk about sexism, don't talk about.
Yeah.
And it's like, there's this weird thing of like, joy exists outside of these things, and it becomes like this way then of kind of weaponizing, like, oh, you're always going on about race, you're always going on about, you know.
Yeah, you become like the feminist killjoy, and you're like, no, just be, yeah. Which is so funny, because I've got a piece of work that I went to Fringe for the first time last year, and everyone like that is like, that has mental health issues, that's neurodivergent, that is disabled, that is like white, were like, take good care. And actually then it was, you know, it's, I mean it was bad, but then like I had white artists being like, take good care. Like, it's just like, what does that mean? Like, is this going to break me? Like, why do you, like, why is it so? But no, but like for years, like I haven't gone for years, and I've always gone no. And then I've got one show that was like, okay, there's enough on my terms, even though it's autobiographical and it's about mental health, but it's so detached from me, if that makes sense, because it was made quite a long time ago, that I feel it's on my terms, and I know exactly what you just said, you know, that I know that I'm going to be consumed, and it's going to be like, especially in that context, because it can vary, can't it? You could be in a space where, like, usually I find if I'm in a queer space, a queer POC and Black space, it's very much like the audience is not trying to consume, it's trying to offer up a witness, like they're witness to something, especially, so, and you can feel the shift in that, you know. And at Fringe, you definitely knew it was on the the other flip. It was like, you know, beer in hand, drinking, watching this, man, and like, I'm gonna go to my next show. You know, like people were literally cramming in trauma after trauma after trauma after trauma, like, and I would be like, like yeah. And actually, it was one of the best times of my life, but that's because of the care structures that I put in place. I had to put like the money and resources that I had to try and find and put myself out of, like, I didn't end up paying myself like how I should have, because I had to make sure that my partner was there. He didn't want to be there because like I want to be, you know, and then a lot of the like it's solo work, right? And that's a weird thing as well about Artists Make Change, is that like artists are seen as individual things,
yes,
and not a collaborate, like, and not collaborate. You know what you said about earlier, you said like the thing about going away, and you're like, they do that to isolate you, to make sure that you can't you organize. So if I use language that I see on like on activism, so it feels like in art that they don't allow you to organize and come together and like feel like, oh shit, they've experienced that, okay, we can come together, and you know, and I don't know, they purposely like, and that's, you know, because a long time I thought, I only make solo work because I like it, and but actually it's like, no, that's the circumstances I was in. I couldn't be with other people, we couldn't afford to be together, we couldn't get a big enough space, you know, all these little things where you're like, actually you know what, and I still now at 30 I don't know what my making process is. Like I don't know if I actually like writing on my own, because I always end up going to someone and being like, I'll find a couple £100, please, like, you know, help me out a bit. So actually, this idea of me thinking that, oh no, I'm a solo artist, I think it's been really kind of put onto me. But at Fringe, in the work I cry, and it's not like I cry on cue. It's just, that's why I always call myself a live artist as well, because like a lot of the work is, I like what you said earlier about like on your terms. I like to be vulnerable on my terms. I like because for me, what my art, because for me at the moment, my art is about, I want to, one of my big aims with my art is to allow myself to feel at home in myself. And to let others feel like they can be at home and stuff. And that's like a really vague thing, but it's to do with trauma and to do with the ideas of like, I actually see you and you see me. And that is that thing between, but then it's also really jarring because then I'm still want to be a show off, and I'm like, but look at me, like, you know, it's all these layers. But so in the work there's a bit, and for Fringe they were like, do you want to take it out, because it's good, you know, we'll do it for 30 days or whatever it is. And I was just like, no, and I nearly I think I cried every day, and Aaron was just like, oh, how is that for you? I said, it's hard, but what's interesting to see in this context, that people don't see this, they don't as soon as the word I say ritual, like say it feels like a purging, it feels great actually. Like there's something about like, I don't know, this weird thing, and people say, oh, it's the British thing not to show emotions. No, I mean, it's whiteness to not, like, you know, like whiteness with a capital W, you know, like that kind of like ideas of like to exploit and harm and binaries and all that shit. And I was just like, it's messy. Like I cry because there's so many reasons I want to, I'm crying, that's okay, and it's on my terms. But what was really interesting about that is that in that context, the crying was seen as such a, like a, I don't know, like a, like shit, like you're doing too much, you're not doing, you know, you need to craft it a bit more back to theatre, and you're like,
interesting.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, because, and that idea that, and that comes back to the idea of performance, and actually in a lot of a lot of European theatre just feels so like, what, like you can do that, you can, and that's why I think I have like passion, or I like live art. I thought I did, but not in certain ways, because it's still very much like within whiteness.
That's really interesting.
But like I just imagine if I saw live art in like in different countries, I'd be like, you know, like I'd be like, oh shit, you know, like.
This reminds me of a really cool thing somebody said to me once, and it was this guy who was studying. I think he was studying like theatre and performance, but he was like, he was South Asian, and he was like, he was like, what I realized is like South Asian culture is just live art. And I was like, what do you mean? And he was just like, have you ever been to a South Asian wedding? And I was like, yeah. And he was like, choreography, lights, action. He was like, to the dress, the costume. And he was like, yeah, but think about it, like, and there's always like this, there's like the bride has to play a certain emotional role as well and look in a certain, and I was like, wow,
God,
yeah. And I was like, you know what, that's, and he was like, what does it mean as well for like certain life and personal rituals to have this performance aspect that you know, and yeah, and I think it's always important to like that. Just had, I don't know, I just remember being really struck by that, being like, oh my god, yeah, it's not like this, you know. And I guess we're always all performing in different ways, and that should also be, because that's something I often think about as well when people are like, oh, you're a performance poet, and I'm like, what does it mean to perform? And like, I feel like just being visibly Muslim in the world, you're already sort of like, it's like you whether or not you want to, you're performing this certain identity to people, and yeah. So I don't know. I think there's all of that, but I wanted to say something else which I've completely now forgotten. What was it about? Oh, just saying that like I think just thinking about it and everything you were saying, like the place that I find the most care and joy and excitement when I'm doing like anything to do with art is actually when I'm doing poetry workshops with young people. And that, you know, because you're just saying about we're always alone, no collaboration, you can't be together. It's like I can't express the feeling that I have when I've worked with young people, and it's just been like, you know, it can be really, there's just something about the way that, because they maybe haven't yet been filled with that propaganda about like what art is, what creativity is, who gets to do it. And I just love that, you know, the other day I was doing this workshop and there were these, it was mainly, I think the youngest were like 5 and 6. And I was like, so is anybody like writing? Is anybody a writer? And like when I've done that with adults, no one wants to. You'll have people who are published poets, they'll be like, absolutely not, I've never written anything. And then these kids were just like, yeah. And this 5-year-old boy, he was like, yeah, I've written 3 books. And I was like, that's amazing. Like, can you tell me what they're about? And he was just like, yeah, in my first book, a pear marries an insect. And I was like, of course. And there's so much joy in that. Do you know what I mean? I was like, this is the stuff where I want, it's like art means something so free. It's so free of like permission and so free of that voyeurism and that consumption and all those things. And it's like, but it's also then the other side of that is slightly heartbreaking that is it with age and experience that where does that bit of art that I think gives it so much, just so much life, or I guess where art is so it's not disconnected from life. It's like, of course I've written 10 books in the last day, you know. It's like it's something more natural at that stage. But yeah.
And I totally hear you, because one of my favorite experiences ever is seeing non-performers perform, right?
Ooh,
I was get on, I like the show I was just talking about as well. My partner's in it, and he has nothing to do with the art world, right? And people love him, and I look like, there is something about actually every project I seem to do now, without even knowing, I end up having someone or being around people that don't have no interest in like this, you know. They're like, you know, but it's because I remember watching a show and they had like, it was non-performers performing, and they were kids as well, so they were like teenage years, and they would like, you know, like if you're watching it, they were dancing, and you know, if you like, people have learned to dance, they would like, you know, not move about because obviously you've got, but these kids would like dance and then like would go out of position because they were a bit bored. Do you know what I mean? And like people like, and they realise that they have to hold this, and like just, it was so, and that was one of the best things I've ever seen, because it was just so, like you said, that lived life, you as a person, and that art, they're not two different things. And I could actually see these whole beings on the stage being like, going through everything, like, I'm bored, I'm excited, on my line, like just, and it was, everyone enjoyed it. So I think in terms of like wrapping up, it's interesting because it feels like actually then not before anything, but adding to the question, like who is the artist, and if maybe artists are making change, they're just not called artists, or yeah. But it's really sad because I'd love to talk to you more and more about this because I'm just having a great time.
No, I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, and yeah, I think I wish we could talk more. Because it's really interesting, and you made me like go like, oh, a bit more like, yeah.
No, same.
And I think the one last thing I want to say is that when you said the thing about, is it with age and experience? I'm like, yeah, that experience of going, this is like younger, this is art, 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 this is art. And then you're just there like, okay, and these are my labels, you know, this is what I do. I mean, like, you say the words interdisciplinary artists, and you're like, just, you know, like, because they, you know, they want to claim these multitudes, they want to go back to that.
Yeah, and that's such a good point.
Yeah.
So maybe your conclusion is, I think that feels right, that we're all, maybe everybody's an artist, and it's about, maybe the question is more just like, why do we even want to ask what, I don't know, like, I think there's now another set of questions I have.
That's what it feels, this 45 minutes feels like a part one, like, you know, like going in like before, and then we talk about like what the change, what is like those change. We'll see what they the guys that are doing this, they might look at it and go, oh, yeah, do another one, you know. Yeah, cool, fine. Okay, well, thank you.